Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions during this presentation, please type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of each presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I'd like to welcome everybody to the August 10th edition of Crop Talk. And with today's webinar, I thought it'd be good to do a crop update of what's happening in the field. Been doing a lot of surveys in the last little while here, and been out in a lot of different fields, a lot of different crops in a fairly large area. So able to see some stuff that's happening out in the field, and talking to a lot of producers and seeing what's happening as of right now, and when they're planning harvest, I guess, is the big question out there right now. And it's amazing how some of the crops have grown, and how some of the crops have caught up in some of the days as well. You know, from thinking that we were going to be seeing very little harvest in August, depending on where you are in the province, I think that might not be the case anymore. I think we're going to be seeing some harvest happening, and which is a good thing, and just how the crops have responded to the additional moisture we've gotten this year, and how they've bounced and back, especially from the later spring. So with that, as I go through, we're going to be talking about different things throughout the day, and I'm going to start with some information from the crop report. And when you look at this, you can see that reportings of crop conditions throughout the province are pretty good right now. Basically, we've got a large portion of the crop anywhere from that good to even some in the excellent type situations. The Interlake, again, from going from really dry to going to really wet, they're still facing some areas where it's still 25% fair, and some crops still in poor conditions. And that's I guess what happens when we go from too dry to too wet in a matter of months. So it's but again, in general, I would say that a lot of the crop can be rated as in good condition. Looking at the spring wheat, and in most cases is completely done flowering, and we're starting to see kernels fill in the heads. We're in that soft, and in some locations even starting to get into the hard dough stage, which is again something that is good to see. Again, we're in the second week of August, and seeing those type of situations does bode well for late August potential for harvest, or at least the first week in September. And I think the biggest concern a lot of people have is our growing days, and how many days we're going to have before we get into some of the cool conditions. And we got a little bit of a scare last week with temperatures dropping below 6 degrees in some areas in the evening, and all of a sudden it was guys were starting to, the frost thoughts comes into a lot of people's heads. Barley, again, barley is in most cases in the milky to soft dough stages, and the later crops, and a lot of these crops that we're sowing on some of the wet land that didn't get planted early enough. Some of that's going to go for green feed. Some producers are actually talking now that those crops have been growing fairly fast and advancing fairly well, that there might be some potential for taking some of that off for grain as well. And I think with some of the producers that I guess the intention was to plant green feed because they're needing the feed, and then with some of the yields coming off of our hay crops, where we're really good this year, are really good this year, and producers are seeing the ability to kind of stockpile some hay and maybe build up some of their reserves. They're thinking now that they might not need those fields for green feed, and are starting to look at the potential of taking them off for grain crop. However, with this time of year and with the growing conditions we've had, we also are seeing a few things happening in the field that normally start showing up at this time of year. And I was in a wheat field a couple days ago, and you can see where disease is definitely starting to show up. Field was sprayed with a fungicide, so it did get you know the application for disease control, but with damp conditions in the morning and just good growing conditions, the diseases started to come back in, and you can see it's working its way from the bottom leaves upwards on the plant, and you can see that even the upper flag leaves are starting to get covered with spots, and a lot of it is the tan spot and septoria. And so, we're definitely seeing the leaf diseases showing up and going to help in actually bringing some of this crop in a little bit faster, because once those leaves are gone, the crop starts to basically starts turning and shutting down. And I guess one of the things there is where we are with a lot of the wheat being that the heads are filling. We're getting to the point where the head alone could probably, get enough sunlight and to finish filling the plant off. So good for the early seeded cereal crops. If it starts to move fast and gets into some of the later seeded cereal crops, we could see some yield reductions. But right now, seeing pretty good stands of wheat out in the field. And just another image of some of the upper leaves of the plants. One of the interesting things that seen yesterday was out in southern Manitoba, and even though with all the moisture we've received this year and still some low areas with standing water, this is out in the middle of the wheat field, and those cracks are big enough that you could stick your hand into the crack of the ground there. So we are seeing the ground dry out, and I guess the importance of a rainfall within the next week to 10 days is going to be a little bit critical, just for helping those plants finish off and get good head and seed development. Not as critical maybe as for some of the cereal crops, but more critical, especially when we get into talking about soybeans later on in this presentation, and the need for that rain to help it continue filling. You look at the long range weather here, and we are maybe looking at some showers towards the weekend, but in general, from what I've been hearing on most of the weather stations, and we're looking at dry and warm conditions with anywhere from normal to a little bit above normal temperatures. So it'd be nice to get a little bit of a shower in that Friday, Saturday, and then continue warm again. Got a couple pictures sent to me this week from a crop consultant, and she had sent some pictures of some wheat heads and some pictures of some flag leaves. And if you notice these wheat heads, the bottom parts of the head, there's some of the spikes are aborted, and they never did produce, or it doesn't look like they'll be producing seed. And from some discussions with Ann Kirk, our cereal specialist, one of the comments she made is the wheat plants usually very early on the growing season, decide the size of the head and how many spikelets are going to be on the head. And then as the plant grows through the season, if it encounters any type of stress, it can decide not to form all those spikelets and basically just have shut down some of those bottom spikelets. So when you look at this, that's what she was seeing. She said she's been getting actually a few calls regarding this. She noticed on these pictures that there was more spikelets than she's been seeing that aren't going to be producing than she's been talking to, and more in the Carmen Morden area. And but when you look at these pictures, it looks like there could be 3 to 4 aborted spikelets, and she said she's been seeing more in the 2 range, but rest of the plant seems fairly healthy, and so that's what Anne has been seeing, and that was some of her comments regarding what might be happening there. Regarding another picture that was sent in, and I kind of added one of mine from a week ago that we maybe talked a little bit about this as well, and there was concerns as to what it might be. I think with some more discussions, we're maybe seeing some physiological leaf spotting showing up on some of our plants as well. And again, it's a lot of that kind of stuff usually happens with environmental issues. Now, depending on the area, if you look at a picture on the right, if it was in the same field where you were seeing some of the spikelets aborting, it could be some environmental stresses that cause that. It also could be causing some of the physiological leaf spotting on the plants as well. They're usually a blocky, angular type kind of a markings on the leaves, and a lot of times they will follow the veins, and as you can see where the one on the right, it seems to be following the veins of the leaves up the plant. The one on the left, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago when we discussed it, it was it also could have been some insect damage that maybe happened earlier on, and this is just some of the remains of what it was left with the leaf. So definitely seeing some issues showing up, and thank you for sending some of these pictures in. It's good to get the information in and then try to get some of these things solved. But I think from talking to Anne, John Hurd also commented regarding maybe a possibility of a nutrient deficiency, and he kind of ruled that one out. And again, one of his comments was maybe physiological leaf spots. So that's some of the things we've been seeing out in the wheat field. I guess another thing seeing the last couple days is a good time to get out there and start looking to see how well your fungicide worked this year to control Fusarium. You look a little bit of a close-up at this wheat head right here. The bottom third or quarter of the wheat head is still nice and green, but these top half to 3/4 of the head are white already and starting to show the Fusarium issues. I didn't get a close-up of it, but definitely look like Fusarium in the field already. I think we had a long infection period this year, and so with the long infection period, I got a feeling that we're going to maybe see some higher levels than normal of Fusarium in the field. The other thing is we had some uneven growth in the field. When you go out into the field right now, it's easy to see areas in the field that are, anywhere from a week behind some of the other parts of the field. And I think with that happening, we're also going to see the potential for more Fusarium showing up in some of those areas, depending on when conditions were favorable for the Fusarium. So with the longer infection period and with just the growing conditions we've had this year, we could be seeing some higher levels of Fusarium. And like I mentioned, I was out in a couple fields yesterday, and it probably wasn't very difficult to find some heads that were showing Fusarium. The other thing noticed in fields, and usually happens when we get these kind of growing conditions as well, is there's ergot starting to show up in some of the wheat fields I was in. I wasn't in any fall rye fields for the last couple of days, and I would imagine if they're showing up in the wheat fields, they'll definitely be showing up in the rye fields. And it's kind of the kind of most susceptible is rye, then triticale, then wheat, then barley, and very seldom do you see it in oats, but it wasn't hard to find it in this one field, and I grabbed just a little bit of information as to how ergot can move in through a field, and why the high risk kind of varieties, anything that's an open pollinated and with a longer flowering period can be more susceptible to ergot. And so when you look at I guess our growing season this year, we've definitely, as I mentioned, our flowering period is longer than normal just because of you know, our spring germination, and also because we're getting some later tillering happening and some secondary tillering. We have had some cool, wet conditions during the flowering season. You know, normally we wouldn't say that, you know, the temperatures were anywhere that, you know, between the 24 to 27 degrees, but our nights were a little bit cooler, and we didn't have those periods where nights would temperatures wouldn't drop, you know, much below 15 sort of thing. This year we've been seeing a fair bit of that too, and then a lot of the mornings we're seeing a lot of dew in the mornings, so we're seeing a lot of you know, just like this morning with the fog and the dew, it's definitely you know, favorable conditions for this type of these types of things to be happening out in the fields. And grass margins, you know, any early flowering grass margins around the field. And I noticed this year as well, a lot of the ditches and field edges, we had a tremendous growth of grass and weeds along those areas. So we definitely have favorable conditions for ergot to be coming in off field margins. So again, just kind of the right scenario for ergot to be showing up. So it's a grading issue if it is bad enough, and it's something that we'll probably see as we go as we get into harvest, as things are going on. So again, just something that was noticed in the fields, and something that keep an eye out for when you're going out and looking for how well some of your fungicides worked for you this year. Looking at oats, and the oat crop is looking really good right now. There's a lot of it is reaching that hard dough stage, and most fields, some of the later stuff, I was in a field that was probably sown in you know, probably the first second week of June, and the oats was still fairly green, like the picture, and a lot of those seeds were still fairly milky. So again, that's some of the later seeded fields. Some of the earlier seeded fields are definitely turning. I was actually in a field yesterday where the producer is probably going to be spraying it by the weekend to get ready for harvest. There was the majority of the kernels were hard already. A lot of the plants has turned, and one of the interesting things I did see in that field was the amount of rust that was in the field. It was showing up pretty much in every field we went to that this producer had. Levels varied from the earlier sown fields that were more mature, seemed to have the higher levels right now, but the later sown fields had small amounts of the pustules in them, and a little bit of a concern for them because rust can move fairly fast in the field, and it'll usually start on the, you know, in the lower leaves and then works its way up in the plant. This one here, the field I was in, it was right up on the flag leaves, and a lot of the flag leaves were starting to look fairly brown already. So this would be one of the first fields that he was looking at spraying, and that was one of the reasons we were talking about desiccation was, you know, regarding how long this field is going to stay in a position where those leaves are still going to be around. So definitely a rust showing up, and I think it's going to be pretty general because like I had mentioned, I was in probably 5 to 6 fields of it yesterday, and every field was showing some of the rust. A question came in and was wanting to know what variety of oats was showing the most rust, and Really can't really comment on that right now. Like I mentioned, this is the first kind of fields that I was in the last couple of days that were showing rust. This producer had grown all one variety, so you know, to say one variety right now is worse than the others, it would be a little bit tough to do. So, but you know, this is something that's interesting. I think we could definitely follow for future webinars as we start seeing the rust showing up more. So, good question, and we'll keep on top of that for future webinars. And just another picture of some of the later oats fields. Now this one wasn't the one sown in June, but this would have been the one sown towards the end of May already. And you can just see how quickly it moves through the crop. And it's just worst case scenario. The concern is if it does hit it quick enough and hard enough that we could get some lightweight oats. And I guess that's probably one of the biggest grading factors in oats right now is not having the weight there. So I think you know, that's going to be a concern. All these fields that I was in yesterday were all sprayed with fungicide, so there was they were definitely taken care of. One comment the producer did make was on the one field, because of the wet conditions, he said he might have sprayed it a little bit on the early side, and maybe that's why there was more disease in that one field than there was in some of the other fields. But again, you know, it's fungicide is only going to last for or protect the crop for so long. So early spraying is something that would be advantageous for disease to come in a little bit later. We got John on the line, John Gabowski. I seen in the pest report that there's been some aphids showing up in oats, and there's been some spraying done. So John, I grabbed these pictures and put them up, and I was hoping you can maybe make a few comments regarding the aphids in oats.
Sure. So first of all, I notice you've picked out two photos, English grain and oat bird cherry aphid. We're seeing both right now in the crops. You're more likely to see English grain aphid right up at the top parts of the plant. And the small grains, they like to go right for the kernels. So you often do see them clustered around the kernels. Whereas the oat bird cherry aphid, they do like to hang out more lower on the plant, often on the stem or some of those lower down leaves. Sometimes you will find them up near the head too, but more often you will find them lower, English grain aphid up higher. Also, just to clarify, if you're doing Google searches, you might see the word bird cherry oat aphid. That's the exact same thing. For whatever reason, Entomology Society of Canada calls it oat bird cherry. In the US, they call it bird cherry oat. Same thing. We're using a threshold of 12 to 15 per stem on average as the threshold. That applies to both species. And when we say per stem, that means per tiller, not just on the stem. So per tiller, 12 to 15 on average is the threshold for both of them. The other thing that we are seeing is some aphids that look brown and inflated. We're seeing a lot of aphid mummies. They're parasitized aphids. They've got a wasp larva that's living inside them when you see them like that. And every now and then you'll see a hole in the back of one. So any that are kind of a light brown, a very inflated color, they're parasitized, so you don't count them. And on the oat bird cherry aphid photo, you'll notice a few white flecks there. Those are shed skins. Sometimes you will see a lot of shed skins in an aphid colony, and just recognize that they are shed skins. Don't count them when you're doing your aphid counts. I should also at least mention that the third picture you've got at the bottom of this slide, Lionel, at the bottom left, the green bug, we're not really seeing much of this insect this year. It's all three of these blow in from the south. They don't overwinter here. So we get what blows in. and the two above are the ones that blew in this year. Green bug, we're not really seeing. I'll say an easier one to ID because it does have that darker green line down the back, but being small, sometimes you really have to look hard to see that. So yeah, so when you're scouting, different ways you can do it. You can count what's on the plant. If it's English grain in the heads, you can tap them over something to try to knock them out. That works as well. Or kind of peel back the head, especially if it's wheat or barley, peel back the head a bit and try to do counts within the head. Sometimes they're clustered within the grains. And once you hit soft dough stage, you don't really need to worry about it anymore. It's up until soft dough that your crop is susceptible to these aphids.
Okay, and so have you been hearing of anybody actually having to spray then, or?
Yes, actually, it's a real mix. You know, some people are finding levels, but they're not really at thresholds, so they're just keeping an eye on things. But there are fields that people have been spraying. I've had reports of spraying from the northwest, southwest, central, and eastern region, so it's not just a particular region. It is widespread in that sense, but certainly not every field in a region. Some fields will have a fair amount, and others not too far away, levels are lower. So you really do have to check individual fields. It might just be a matter when they got blown in, what was at the most enticing stage for the aphids. Hard to know, but it really does vary between fields.
Okay, and I had a comment, I can't remember what date for sure. Anyways, producer said he came out of, walked into his field and came out of his field and he felt sticky. Is that because of aphids, or?
Well, there could be a couple of reasons. Aphids right now is the most likely because what aphids do, they feed on the sap of the plant, and the sap doesn't contain a lot of protein, so they have to eat a lot of sap to get the nutrients they need. And in doing so, they excrete a lot of a liquid we call honeydew. It's kind of a sugary, sappy type of liquid that they excrete. And that gets on the leaves, and so you have this sticky liquid all over the plant if there's been a lot of aphids. And yes, walking through the field, you would come out feeling a little bit sticky. Now, the other thing that can cause that, but I'm not expecting it, cereal leaf beetle earlier in the season, late June, early July, they make that feces coating over their body. And if you have a lot of them, when you walk out, you come out, and I won't say sticky, but more a greasy black layer might be on your jeans as you come out of the field if you've got cereal leaf beetle. But we didn't really see a lot of that this year. So odds are if they came out, their pants are a little bit sticky, it's probably the honeydew from the aphids.
Okay, good. Thanks, John. Okay, so, and just maybe one more comment before we leave the whole rust thing. I know when we walked out of the fields yesterday, our pants were pretty much brick red in a lot of places. So that's another key, I guess, as you're going through the fields and you're walking out, and maybe to let you know that you do have some rust. Okay, leaving oats and now maybe going to some of the winter crops, and maybe they were the ones we should have started with because they'll be the ones that are probably first being harvested. But fall rye is turning quickly, and we are seeing some harvest. I did see some combines in the Hartney area yesterday going. They were doing fall rye. Then also reports out of Morden and Manitou, so we're just starting to see some of those fields starting to come off. I don't think I've heard enough reports as to as to what yields might be right now, but the crop did look fairly good. Besides in some areas where it's tended to get fairly dirty later on in the fall here, and with some of the harder to kill weeds growing, and so I've seen some of that. So that might make harvest a little interesting in some areas. Also seeing some producers doing some swathing, and always scares me a little bit to see that, because you get those fall rye fields that are so fluffy when you swath those swaths, that I just hope we don't get too many strong winds, because we definitely don't need those swaths blowing around. But there was 2 or 3 producers that I seen yesterday swathing their fall rye, and that could be for a number of reasons, and maybe one of them is because of the weeds, and they're wanting to get them to dry down. Winter wheat, haven't heard of any winter wheat being combined yet. I've talked to a couple producers that are looking at, probably pre-harvest in the next little while here. And in some areas, I would imagine on the eastern side of the province, we're probably seeing some of it being done already, and maybe even to the point where we're seeing some of the winter wheat being harvested. But again, haven't heard of too many yield reports right now, so it's a little too early to talk about yields on fall rye or winter wheat. There definitely was a good enough stand in both of them to maybe predict average yields right now, but again, we'll see as the harvest gets going here in the next continues in the next week here, week to 10 days. So leaving the cereal crops and looking at canola. Canola crops, again, are variable across the province. We've got some crops that are looking excellent. We've got some crops that are looking poor, and we've got flowering ranging from mid to full bloom to some crops that are fully potted. I was actually by a field yesterday that was actually probably 25% turned already now, and so it's depending on when it was planted and the growing conditions it had. I've talked to producers in the last couple of days that canola looks great and didn't have any flea beetle issues at all. Crop advanced well and looks good, to guys that sprayed 4 or 5 times, and just some producers that only had certain fields they had to spray 4 or 5 times. So it's a mixed bag when you're looking at canola this year. Talked to one producer that had a drone, and he flew some of his fields, and he says it's surprising what you see from the road to compare what you see across the field. He said a lot of those wet spots that were fairly big and earlier on have reduced in size, and that's probably more for other plants compensating for the extra room they had. But there's still a lot of areas out there, he said, that are fairly wet and and nothing growing in them. So he was more concerned that he had more acres that probably got drowned out than he actually thought. Basically haven't heard of any major insect issues to date so far, but again, it's something that we'll be keeping an eye on, and I'm sure John will have in his reports as we got any pop-up areas where we might be looking at Bertha or Diamondback. Leaving canola and turning over to peas. Majority of the peas have finished flowering and are filling pods. Early seeded fields are turning color right now. I haven't heard of anybody spraying yet to bring the crop in for harvest, but I don't think we're too far away on some fields. In some areas, excess moisture hurt some of the crop, and we're seeing some low areas where there's very poor growth and like no production at all. But that's kind of expected where you get water standing for long periods of time. One of the things we are seeing and developing fairly quickly in a lot of the crop is Microsparella. Seen several fields in the last week where producers had sprayed fungicide. Some producers had sprayed twice with fungicide, and we're still starting to see on lower leaves for sure. This picture was some of the upper leaves that were showing the Microsparella already, and again, depending on the stage and when it gets onto the pod as to how much it's going to affect yield and quality. This field probably maybe a little bit more at risk than some of the other fields I was in, as they were starting to turn already. The other thing we're seeing in some of the fields is bacterial blight showing up, and you can see the staining on the pod and on this picture as well. So seeing a combination of issues showing up in peas right now. And again, you could just see some of the staining on the pods. One interesting thing I did notice on a few of those pods where the blight was, the pod seemed to just be tighter. And then as those seeds developed on the inside and started to get to their full size, they looked like they're cracking open the pod, and so we might see some yield loss there. And then you see some of the plants that kind of got the full whack, and here's a combination of bacterial blight, Microsparella on the top leaves and on the plant as well. And then there was some aphid damage, and it's really hard to see in the picture here, but there's these top crunch part up in the top of this plant. There's a bunch of aborted flowers. Now I didn't see the aphids. I'm assuming that was aphid damage that caused them to abort. It might have been the bacterial blight, but it just, the producer had mentioned when I was out in the field that he had sprayed for aphids, and he said he should have sprayed the second time with fungicide, but he didn't. And when he was spraying for aphids, and this is one of the fields I was in where the producer is probably going to be looking at desiccating within a week to 10 days, and at least a good portion of the field anyways, where the crop is turning. Another field where moisture is becoming an issue as well. It was on some shale type soil, and it's drying out, and you could definitely see patches throughout the whole field where it was turning aggressively, and then the lower areas where there's still some moisture where the crop is still green. So going to be a little bit harder decision for him to make as to when to go in and take the crop, but it's definitely turning, and for a field like that, we could see peas harvested, definitely harvested before the end of the month. So when we were talking in the field, he was asking when would be the right time to spray and what he should be looking for to spray, and I thought it'd be maybe a good opportunity to mention some things to look for when you're out in the field and making that decision. The first thing is to watch for color pod change. You want the bottom 3/4 of the pods to be brown, and the seed should be firm inside there, almost rubbery. And when you squeeze those seeds inside those plants in the bottom 3/4, so they split in your hands, but it also takes a fair bit of pressure to split those ones. So that's one thing to look for. Peas are going to mature from the bottom up, so that's just things to watch for as you're looking at the plant. That's why you definitely watch from the bottom up as you make your decision. Tops of the plants, they may still have some green in them, but when you open up those top pods and you put pressure on the pea seed, it should split in your hand, but it shouldn't be squishy when you do that. It should just split easily when you put some pressure on it, and shouldn't be a whole bunch of juice in it. And kind of the recommended is around 30% moisture. So I guess if you wanted to go through a fair bit of work, you could grab a bunch of plants, shell them out, and do a moisture test on it. It's always a tricky thing to do, because how do you know you're getting representative plants? It's kind of like, at harvest time when you go out there with one of those little harvesters to take a sample to see what the grain's testing, and then you take it back and you test it, and then you go, you should have took the combine out and did a sample, and it would have been more representative. So to me, that's always a confusing thing. So, I would do for a lot of the visual things and make the decisions that way. Again, some plant fields are going to be a little bit more difficult, and in a field where you have some premature drying, whether it be disease or whether it be moisture, look at your field and figure out percentages, figure out what percentage is green, what percentage isn't, and make the decision as to where you're going to get most of your yield from, and then just monitor your field to see how fast some of the areas are ripening. Soybeans, they're moving along quickly here, and they like the wet conditions they had. They're chest high in a lot of places right now, in the R4 to R5 stage, and so normally that stage you're going to have on the plant, you're going to have on the upper pods, pods that are 3/4 to an inch long, and you're going to have seeds developing in those pods that, you could start to see the development of seeds in those pods. So that's the stage a lot of the soybeans are at right now. There has been some reports of soybean aphids in the area, and some grasshoppers, and maybe what I'll do is I'll get maybe John to come on again and maybe make some comments regarding the soybean aphids and what to look for there. So John, if you could make a couple comments there, please.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as Lionel mentioned, we are seeing some soybean aphid populations. Now the highest levels seem to be further east from where you are. The eastern region, there's been some spraying, and even a little bit in the central region in around Carmen. I'm not aware of any spraying anywhere west of Carmen at this point. Something to keep an eye on, certainly. Levels can really take off quickly if they're not being controlled by natural enemies, so something you need to watch. One thing to note if you're scouting for soybean aphids, we have our threshold of 250 per plant, and the threshold increasing still. It is not really possible to sit there and try to count 250 aphids. Don't try. You're estimating. Now, if you've only got 30, 40 aphids on a plant, you might be able to count it quite comfortably. But if you do have something around threshold, it's really not possible to count. They're tiny things. They will move around a bit or fall off of plants as you're trying to count. So you have to get good at estimating levels, and we do have some resources on our website. There's aphid scouting keys where you can look at a picture and see how what you're seeing relates. It's just a matter of getting comfortable estimating levels. We do recommend using the 250 per plant and population increasing threshold. I know there's been some talk that, well, the soybean prices are a lot higher now than they were when that threshold would have come out, so we should lower that threshold. But entomologists are discouraging people from doing that because the true economic injury level, which is the point where the amount of feeding damage the aphids do equal your application and insecticide costs, that's actually just under 700 aphids per plant, so something about 670 aphids per plant. So you've got a big gap between the economic injury level and that 250, which is the economic threshold. That was built in, that huge gap was built in to give people at least a week to spray their crop before you would hit that 670. So with that huge gap, that also accounts for some of the increases in pricing. If you can get the insecticide on in the next day or two after you discover an economic population, you should have no problem. That 250 is the appropriate threshold to use. The risk of spraying too early is you can get rebounding of populations, and also you might as well give the natural enemies a chance if you can, and also it reduces your risk of insecticide resistance if you can be delaying those sprays and possibly avoiding a second spray. So use that 250 aphids per plant and populations increasing right up until the R5 stage.
Hey, John, I was talking to a producer and he was asking me, like, when I go out into the field and start looking, where is the best place to look to find, like, where are they going to be doing their damage? Like, if they're on the stems and stuff, he was one, or are they on the pods? Like, where should he be looking? Because of the numbers so high, he was just wondering, you know, where to target his sites, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, good questions. The best thing to do is just start turning over leaves, especially some of those upper leaves. Start turning them over and having a look there. They sometimes do start coating the stems and even up onto the pods, but that's often more when you get some of the very heavy populations. Early on, when levels are low, people usually find them just by turning over leaves. So that would be a good thing to start doing, is just turning over leaves. With soybeans, with soybean aphid, they're trickier than, say, pea aphid. Pea aphid, you just start shaking the plant tips, and you can get a good idea quickly doing that with the levels. Like soybean aphid takes a little bit more work because just shaking the plants isn't really a good method. You do have to start turning over leaves, having a look more thoroughly at the plants.
Okay, good. Yeah, and if you miss them, the damage they're going to do is they'll, like, a lot of the soybean plants are getting close to being done flowering, so we're getting to pod development. So are they just going to suck on the pods or do damage to the pods? Is that what they do, or is it going to be, or just because the leaves are going to be gone, they do, that's the damage they do?
Well, with aphids in general, their biggest impact on plants is their competition for phloem. That's mainly what they're feeding on. Most aphids, most of their feeding is to the phloem as opposed to the xylem. So they're basically a drain on the phloem supply. So the soybean plant is producing phloem, which is needed to help fill the seeds. Aphids are competing for that. Low levels, not a big deal. Really high levels, that can be a big drain. Even more devastating if you have drought conditions tossed in, which fortunately we don't have this year. But yes, that's how they work. They're basically competing for the phloem sap. Now on soybeans, a lot of them will be lower down on the plant, not right up on the pod, which is different than the situation, say, in peas, where they cluster right on the flowers, the buds, the pods, which is why the threshold there is 2 to 3 per plant tip, and in soybeans it's 250 per plant. A lot depends on where they're feeding. So when they're not feeding directly on the pod, but they're feeding lower on the plant, on the leaves, they're still competing for that phloem, but it's not going to have the same impact as if they were all clustered, say, on the pods. So hence our higher threshold. But that's really how they're affecting your yield. If things are bad enough, if levels are really high, then you might start seeing the leaves turning color and curling up, and the plant's almost looking droopy. They're basically having enough of the sap sucked out of them that the plants will actually start looking a bit droopy. So that's very heavy infestations. And when that starts happening, then almost just like severe drought stress, you're just not having a lot of sap getting to those seeds to help them fill.
Okay, good. And just one more question. Mentioned I was in the kind of the Hartney area yesterday, and I'm noticing some fairly high levels of grasshoppers, and they're moving in from the ditches now into the field. Any comments, I guess, while we're talking about insects here on grasshoppers? Have you been hearing any kind of areas where producers might be doing some spraying?
People are doing some, well, certainly some full fields have been sprayed, but quite a bit of edges. This time of year, what happens is as some crops will start maturing, the grasshoppers are going to be moving, looking for, I'll use the term greener pastures, areas that have food that is a bit more appealing to them. So you do get grasshoppers moving around if they were, say, in a roadside ditch that's been either cut or is drying down, or say they were in a cereal crop that is starting to mature. That will get them moving, looking for something else lush and green. That's when they will start moving into crops like soybeans, canola. Those, in general, soybeans, canola, they're not the favorite food source of grasshoppers. If they hatch out in a field, they will certainly feed on them. So sometimes you do get whole fields being sprayed. But often with crops like that, we see them move in later. And if you can catch that movement, sometimes an edge spray just to keep them out. An edge spray with something with a good residual will prevent that movement further into the field. So sometimes that's an option. Sometimes they will settle in the ditches if they're good and lush, and they don't really do much aside from maybe the outer few rows of the crop. So one thing I do encourage when you're scouting grasshoppers, I know they're very, very tricky to get good estimates of when they're jumping around and you're trying to do counts, but just get a good sense of what the levels are like at the field edge and walk in a little ways if it's possible to get into the closer to the center of a canola field or soybeans, and just see what the populations are like as you progress into the crop. That will help you with your decision making. And again, don't get too caught up on accurate counts, just like with the soybean aphids, estimate. Are you in that 7 to 12 per meter square range, which is, if you're using grasshopper counts for thresholds, that's generally what we consider threshold. You can't do accurate counts. You're estimating. You're just trying to figure out, are we in that range, or is it just, say, 2 or 3 per meter square, or is it 20, 30 per meter square, which in that case makes your decision making a bit easier.
Okay, yeah, I know. I was definitely seeing them on the ditches for sure, and numbers probably in that 10 to 15 range. But the ditches this year have got so much good growth in them that you walk into the field and after 3 or 4 steps they were barely around. So I think you're right there. I think if they're happy in the field, they are in the ditches, they might just stay there.
Yeah, and I'll just mention one more thing too. We do a grasshopper survey every August, where we try to get estimates of grasshopper levels from different parts of the province. So that's ongoing right now. I'll have the details in this week's Manitoba Crop Pest Update again. If anybody's interested in contributing an estimate to the survey, please feel free. There'll be a link to the protocol at the very end as a data sheet. All you got to do is record the GPS coordinates, the date, and an estimate, not an exact count, but an estimate that we had roughly 10 per meter square or 2 or 3 or whatever, if anyone's interested.
Great. Thanks, John. Okay, one other thing that I've been seeing in soybeans, and I actually got this picture or maybe a week ago now anyways, and I sent it to Dennis Lang, and he confirmed it was bacterial blight. So we got bacterial blight showing up in lots of crops, but soybeans are one that normally get it, and again, not a huge issue. Usually can basically grow with it and still develop. So I think something we all see. This was an extreme leaf that I found, but in general, it was very low levels. So maybe just another comment on something else that I noticed. I noticed yesterday about some of the flax fields. One of the good things this year about not having a week long of 30 or 30 plus degree temperatures, that seemed to benefit the flax. I'm seeing lots of flax fields that have been flowering for over 2 weeks already, and still still having flowers. So that's definitely a good sign for flax. And they got the moisture, so they're looking pretty good. So a good thing for flax this year and for the producers that are growing it. A few more slides before we finish off today. One thing I wanted to mention is Manitoba Ag staff are going to be leading a workshop, and the workshop's going to, I guess it's going to help with producer or with anybody that wants to know about our website and how to navigate our website. There's how to work the email, the internet skills, how to find information on our website, and you know, just like we've had different programs, how to fill out online applications. And so they're planning this in November, and they're going to be having them in different locations throughout the province. So they're going to be in person, and so you'd be able to sit down with some staff and go through some of the stuff that is on our website, and just learn more about I guess learn more about some of the good information that's out there for you to use. So I wanted to put this up, and it'll be probably coming up quite a few more times because this will be held in November, but just a heads up, so to plan it on your calendar. Crop guides.
Lionel, it's David here.
Oh, hi, David.
I wonder if I missed any disease questions today. I've just been able to get to a spot where I've got some coverage.
Okay, the only thing that I wasn't sure you were on. So I was in Oats yesterday, and I wanted to get your comments on rust showing up in oats. And have you been hearing much about it or seeing much in your travels?
Not in my travels, Lionel, but yes, it came to our attention this week that there is crown rust on oats in a few locations. One is near Darlingford, that's west of Morden. And hearing about that, I went out to our university farm here in Carman, looked at the oats, and it too had crown rust. Now, you're only going to find it, I expect, near streams or river courses. That's because of the influence of the alternate host, buckthorn. We have not had rust spores blowing into our region from the south. So all infection is going to be localized, and you'll probably even see a gradient as you get some distance from these river courses.
Okay. You're on your phone, are you?
I am, yes.
Okay, so I've got a picture up, and yesterday the field I was, well, it was probably be over 2,000 acres of it anyways. And a lot of the leaves were covered with rust pustules. So is that crown?
Sorry?
Is that crown rust?
Did you rub the leaves with your hands?
Yeah.
Did you walk through and get
covered in rust? Yeah.
Well, I haven't heard of any cases that serious. The two varieties that we were dealing with yesterday were Surus, which is now considered to be susceptible, and CDC Endure, which is on the U of M farm, and it's rated as moderately resistant. So could the variety have been an older variety that's fully susceptible?
You know, we didn't talk too much about varieties, so I can easily find that out. But there was, like, it was easy to find everywhere. Every field we went to, it was basically, we walked out and our jeans were red.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd be interested in following up on some of that. Of course, depending on the development stage, I think we're well beyond any fungicidal control.
Yeah, everything was sprayed with a fungicide, and the field, the first field we were in, he's probably going to be spraying on the weekend, and other fields are going to be probably, you know, 10 days later sort of thing. But
I see.
So I'm not sure if it's going to have a big impact on yield for him. But again, on the later fields, it'll depend on how fast it moves through the crop.
Right. By your description, Lionel, it does sound like that is something that will have an impact on yield. Okay. If not on yield, then definitely on the weight and thinness of the kernels.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier on, and that's what I mentioned to him. Then on maybe not the first section we were in, anyways, but because that's going to get sprayed here right away. But the stuff that was a little bit late, I was telling him that some of the lower kernels were still milky, and my concern there is they might be some lightweight oats there. So.
Right. You know what I said earlier about the source of the alternate host? I think that's still key. But once there are those orange urea spores, you can definitely get secondary infection happening. That is, those spores are dislodged and blow to other parts of the field that were not infected earlier on. And that might explain the corner-to-corner distribution.
Okay, yeah, and it probably 8 miles between field, like, to cover all the field sort of thing, an 8-mile radius. And even the later seeded stuff, like he had some that was sown the second week of June. They're still fairly green, but when we stopped there, it wasn't hard to find small pustules on those plants. But the early ones, like the picture I have up here, like, basically it's half of the leaf is covered with spores.
Okay. Well, Lionel, I don't want to prolong the call, but this sounds serious enough that I'd like to follow up with you after, when we're offline, or when I get to a place of better coverage. So maybe we'll talk later today, huh?
Okay, great. I'll give him a call and I'll find out the variety too. I wasn't 100% sure. It might be Cirrus, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, good.
Good.
Thanks, Lionel.
Okay. Thanks for calling in, David.
Hey, no problem.
Yeah, so just to continue on here, there's the contact information for the ag adaptation specialists in the province here. So definitely, if you're seeing issues out in your field and you want to get some stuff identified, we got access to a lot of people that like David and John and the rest of the scouting panel that can definitely help in figuring out some of these things that are happening, going on in the field. Livestock people, they've been busy with a lot of producers talking about the crop that's coming in. I wanted to mention the Manitoba hay listing service. So if you're a producer that's got hay for sale, it's a great place to advertise hay for sale. Also a great place to put your name in if you're looking to buy feed. So definitely look at that. And if you need more information about how to get on it and do stuff, I'm sure if you contacted any one of the livestock specialists, they could walk you through it. Or if you dial our 1-800 number and probably talk to Lori or Aaron, they would probably help you with that as well. Our service centers throughout the province, there's their contact information, our 1-800 number. And with that, I don't think there's any more questions. So thanks for attending, and join us next week, August the 17th, for Crop Talk, and we'll be talking more harvest issues and more things that are showing up from all the surveys that are happening right now.